Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. Yesterday we talked about the fact that we can relate with David and the other psalmists when they speak about these enemies that rise up against them. Oftentimes, perhaps as we're reading through the Psalms, we think that perhaps they don't really relate to us because we don't have people who are physically persecuting us and maybe physically hurling abuse at us like many of the Psalms convey. But we do have other enemies. And yesterday we talked about the fact that we could have emotional enemies, that is, like depression, despondency, sorrow, that type of thing. They can rise up in our hearts and in our minds and be that adversary that puts that negative thinking in our minds and our hearts and continually afflicts us day after day after day. And we talked about how to deal with that. Well, today in our reading, we get to talk about another type of enemy. And this one's not necessarily a physical enemy, nor a emotional enemy, but a spiritual enemy. And in Psalm 17, we read about this. And here, David is speaking about physical enemies, that is, those who were persecuting him in a very physical, outward way. But the words that he uses and the verbiage that he uses is also reused, you could say, with the Apostle Peter in relaying it to Satan. He says, in talking about his enemies, David does in Psalm 17, he says, "From the wicked who despoil me, my deadly enemies who surround me, they have closed their unfeeling heart, with their mouth they speak proudly. They have now surrounded us in our steps. They set their eyes to cast us down to the ground. He is like a lion that is eager to tear, and as a young lion lurking in hiding places." They're describing his enemies as those who would surround David and his men, and they were lurking, they were seeking to tear them to pieces. And David was using very familiar imagery that he would have known from being a shepherd. As he was tending to the sheep, a lion could come up and devour much of the sheep and destroy his flock. And here he's using that idea with him and his men and these enemies that were rising up against them, and uses this imagery of a lion that's coming to destroy and to tear. Well, Peter in 1 Peter chapter 5 speaks of the devil in the same way. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, he says, "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." So here he's using language that David had used, but now not talking about necessarily a physical enemy that's rising up, but a spiritual enemy, and that is the devil himself, which is in line with Ephesians chapter 6 that tells us that, we don't really wrestle against flesh and blood, but against those dark forces in the heavenly places. It's those principalities in the heavenly places in the spiritual realm that is really coming up against us. So even if we have a physical enemy, that is a human being that's rising up against us, oftentimes there's spiritual forces behind that. But Satan here can be seen as our ultimate adversary. And Peter gives us a way in which we can overcome this adversary. And it has to do with faith. He says, as he continues in verse 9, "But resist him firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world." The way to resist the devil is through faith. The same way that David dealt with his adversaries and his enemies, as we see in the psalm. How did he deal with the situations he was in? Through faith. By exercising faith in God, trusting God, devotion to God, he overcame his enemies, and he was able to be triumphant at the end. And the same thing is true with us, with our adversary, with the devil. One thing that the devil wants to do is to tear to pieces our faith and to rend it and tear it and cast it away. But if we stand firm in the faith, if we resist him and hold fast to our faith, even through difficulties and trials and hardships and temptations, then Satan loses a foothold. Then the devil, this roaring lion, has nowhere to afflict us because we are standing firm in our faith. We are resisting him. And when we do that, we take away any foothold that he might take in our lives. And so as we do our reading, particularly in Psalm 17, let's think of this also from a spiritual standpoint, with the spiritual enemies that we have that rise up against us. The devil, and then all the spiritual beings that are working on his behalf. We can think about them as our enemies as well, and pray the same types of prayers that David prayed against our spiritual enemies, and pray to the Lord that he would strengthen us and guide us and help us to lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one, that he would be the one who would give us deliverance over our enemies, whether they be physical, emotional, or spiritual. So this is our encouragement today. Let's stay firm in the faith. Let's resist the devil. Let's hold fast to God's word, believe God's word, take it in, soak it in, and live it out. And if we do that, we will be able to more readily overcome this adversary, the devil, who rises up against us and who wants to rend our faith to pieces. So with that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.